Hey football fans, Tony Jones here. Getting a lot of questions on the IHSA playoffs. How do they work? How do teams get in? How are seeds determined? How are classes determined? All these different things. Well, there's a ton of information out there. There's a lot of stuff to sift through. We've been through this many years now. So I figured I'd share a little bit of the basics with you and help you determine how the IHSA football playoff system works. So there's a couple of things that you have to know to really start out. And this is the three things I'm going to go over with you. First of all, which teams get in? That's the most important part right there. In which class then does each team get placed? And then finally, how do you get seated within your respective class? So how do they determine which teams get in? The IHSA takes the top 256 teams with a record of 5-4 or better. In Illinois, we have 8 classes, 32 teams each, 256 total teams. And you are said to be qualified for the playoffs with a record of 5-4 or better. Now you'll notice I have a little bit of a star there. We've got an exception this year and an interesting scenario coming around, and I'll go over that later in this video. Your top 256 teams, this is based on record, your flat out record, then points, and then any tiebreakers, any needed tiebreakers. Obviously, with 256 teams, you're going to have a bunch of teams at 9-0. You're going to have a bunch of teams at 8-1, 7-2, so on and so on. How do we determine that? Well, there's things like points and tiebreakers that factor into how this is all going to work. A couple of things. Doesn't matter where you're ranked. It doesn't matter if you're number 1 in the state, number 256 in the state. Your record, your points is what's going to determine max preps, national rankings, all of that stuff. None of that matters. It's the things that the IHSA has put forth. And it doesn't matter if you've beat up on a bunch of teams and you're not 5-4. It doesn't matter if you got beat up on a bunch of teams or got beat up on by a bunch of teams and you're 5-4. Your record, your points against opponents, things like that. Those are what determine how you get in. So once you're in that 256 team field, how do they determine which class you get put into? As I mentioned, there are 8 classes within Illinois, 8A through 1A, 8 being the largest schools, the biggest of the big, the New Triers, etc., all the way down to 1A, which are your small schools that may just have a couple of hundred kids, if not maybe even 100, 150 kids. So those top 256 teams get sorted by enrollment. Once they sort by enrollment, they place the 32 largest teams into 8A. And then they take the next 32 teams and they put them in 7A. The next 32 in 6A. And they keep going all the way through that until all 256 teams are placed into the 8 respective classes. Now there's a couple of things here that you need to know about when teams get placed. One is multipliers for our privates. So a lot of our private schools actually have very small enrollments. Some of them are maybe even just a couple of hundred. Because they have the ability to recruit and go beyond their community, they get multipliers. So a private that would normally be, let's say, for example, in a 2A or a 3A scenario, purely based on enrollment, could get moved up to a 4, 5, or 6 based on the multiplier. Just depends. A couple of years ago, the IHSA put in what they call a success factor. If you're a team that has won multiple state championships over a period of time, you're actually going to get a multiplier put on you that would move you up. So let's say that you're a team that has won 3, 4, or 5 times in a 5-year span in 6A, you're actually going to get bumped up to 7A for that, or whatever the current multiplier is for that success factor. And then there's a concept of a voluntary move up. And a great example of this is Chicago Phillips. I think by enrollment, they're actually a 4A team. I could be wrong on that. They have voluntarily moved themselves up to 7A. Now, all of that goes into determining what those 32 field teams are in each of the respective classes. You have to factor that in. It's really important. Now, where will Yorkville land? The last couple of years, we've been in 6A, but we are right on the cusp. 1763 is the current cutoff for 7A. So as of the making of this video, they actually have us in 7A. Last week at this time, they had us in 6A. So we're right there. We're right there on the bubble, and it's just going to be determined on how many teams get into 8A and 7A, and then some of these other things that I talked about with the multipliers with teams moving up. So the pairing party show on October 26th is going to be really interesting because we know we're in, but it'll be interesting to determine which class we end up with, what our seed is, and then who we end up playing in that first round. All right, so you've made the 256 field team. You've now been determined which class you're in. How do they determine what your seed is and who you're going to be playing in that first round? First of all, it's your record, of course. If let's just say, for example, we're in 6A, they're going to take all the 9-0 teams and they're going to rank them. Now, if there are multiple 9-0 teams, how do they determine which one is the top overall seed? Well, that's where things like points and tiebreakers then start to kick in again. So the 9-0 team with the most number of points is going to be your top seed. And if there's two teams at 9-0 with 40 points, then that's going to go to the next tiebreaker and so on and so forth until you can determine what the entire field is. So let's show a little bit of an example of this. Why are points so important? Obviously, you're going to have a bunch of teams in a class that are going to have the same record, whether it's 9-0, 8-1, 7-2, what have you. Your points, first of all, how do I determine points? Points are added up. They are all of your opponent's wins. So you very simply go to your opponents and you look and say, all right, all of my opponents, if I add up their W's, it's 30 points, 35 points, 40 points. The more points, the better. The more points you have indicates that you've played a stronger schedule, and thus you should be moved up in the overall seeds. And by the way, this is regardless of whether you've beat them or not. You're going to get points for all of their wins. So we really want all of the teams that we've already played to get as many wins as they can, to give us as many points as we can, to give us a higher seed when we get to the playoffs. So here's an example of how this worked last year. All of these teams that I have listed here are 6-3, but you'll notice Greenville had 39 points and Olney had 38 points. So that determination right there made Greenville, for example, a 7 seed and Olney an 8 seed, or however they worked out. But that's how the points go into determining what your seed are, or what your seed is. In 2019, there are some factors. There's some crazy things going on. And the biggest thing right now is the looming Chicago Public Schools strike, which could take a bunch of teams right out of the field. Imagine, trying to fill 256 spots and you have no teams from the Chicago Public School system. It's a little unprecedented. IHSA is working right now to kind of figure out, first of all, is this even going to be a problem? As of today, I think the strike deadline is 2 days from now. It's Thursday. They're rescheduling a bunch of games to try and get teams qualified, and then maybe they can resolve the strike if indeed it does happen. But let's say, for example, the strike does happen, and it's just, again, one of these unprecedented situations. We have to fill the 256 team field. So the IHSA is going to have to make a determination of how that happens. And there's some talk right now that they could allow 4 and 5 teams to get into the field, which is, I've never seen that happen. There's also talk that they would actually put all of those teams that playoff qualified from Chicago Public Schools in, and then if they're not able to play, if their school is still on strike, they would simply forfeit that team, and it's kind of like a first round bye for whatever team would be lined up to play against them. So I know that was a lot of information to get out in a short amount of time, but hopefully you kind of understand how the field is determined, how you get put into your respective classes, and then how you get seated within your respective class. As of the making of this video, Yorkville, we're 6-1. We're in great shape. More wins helps us out even more. The boys are playing great. We've got a really positive outlook. Tune in October 26th. 8 p.m. to watch the playoff pairing show to see where Yorkville is going to land. I hope this video was helpful. Go Foxes.